Now, the much talked about G20 Leaders Summit has come and gone, and lots of discussions were had ranging from inequality and solidarity and the non-attendance of the US, as well as the summit declaration continued to make headlines during the two-day-long summit this weekend. And to help us unpack this and many other issues of importance, we are now joined by Professor Alex van den Heever. He's from the Wits School of Governance, as well as international relations expert Klaas Mokgomole. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. And Professor, I'd like to start off with you. I mean, this G20 Leaders Summit has now come and gone. It's the first G20 summit to be held on African soil. And when you look at what many have characterized as, a successful G20 Leaders Summit, how would you look at it, particularly at a time where this is the first time where the continent is holding the summit?
I think it's an incredibly important conversation and summit that's just been held. I think it's incredibly important that it's been held on African soil. And it's actually very important that the 19 countries that participated, excluding the US, participated and were fully cooperative with South Africa and in effectively reflecting on the issues within Africa. These are not simple issues to solve, and many of them do require multilateral solutions. And I think that the more we have these global discussions on these issues, the kind of things that you cannot resolve at an individual national level, whether in Europe or in Canada or in South Africa, are now dealt with and kind of put on the table. It doesn't mean they're solved overall, but it does create a kind of a commitment and a trajectory and a direction. And I think that that's what's on the table. And I think it was very important that Europe, Canada, Australia, and a lot of the very developed and large countries participated, despite the fact that the United States really behaved quite oddly.
And Klaas, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, we all know that the US was not involved when it comes to this year's G20 summit. Something that was very important that took place just on the first day was seeing the declaration being adopted, and something that, the US did not want to really see take place in the country. And there was a lot of pushback throughout the year. What do you make of the fact that this is the first time where we are seeing such a superpower as the US not, making its way to the G20 Leaders Summit, and also seeing the declaration being adopted with a consensus?
Thank you, Mbali, for having me. I think there was an odd behavior from the United States. We all can agree that G20 is actually a platform and a vital platform for countries to actually discuss economic development. And with the fact that it's taking place for the first time in Africa, we were discussing African development, economic development.
Klaas, unfortunately, we are struggling there with your line, and it seems as if you are back. Yes, you can continue.
Okay, I was trying to say that I think we need to sort of establish whether the United States is trying to sort of set a precedent that G20 can actually be avoided, because now when a big superpower like that decides that they're not going to be playing a role in discussions of African development or European development or international development of economy, now it makes us question the legitimacy in nation building, in world building, and other economical issues that we are faced with.
And Professor, coming back to you and looking at the magnitude of this specific G20 summit, and looking at now the responses in which we are seeing from the US when it comes to the declaration and this ultimate handover of the G20 presidency. And we've seen, communication from the White House press secretary also then talking about issues around weaponizing the G20, accusing South Africa of weaponizing the G20 presidency and making it a more climate-focused G20 next year.
Well, I think I don't think that it's South Africa that's been weaponizing the G20 agenda. When you withdraw and you try and test your authority and the extent to which you can sway the other G20 members into, following your will and not having it followed is an indication of what the true pull is of the United States. They are important. But essentially, the other countries didn't listen to that. And the climate transition is really important, and the sort of just energy transition is important. Unfortunately, we have only one planet and we've got to look after it. And this trajectory has to be agreed on. It has to be multilateral. And because the climate crisis has largely been caused by the global north and the industrialized countries, it can't be that the developing countries pay the price. So the just energy transition discussion is a very important one. And we did see commitments from Germany, Europe, etc., to South Africa on that particular aspect. So I think that we're going to see financial commitments. We're going to see people working on that. I think they were the adults in the room. In the United States, I think that it's a question as to how long Donald Trump's agenda kind of remains prevalent as national policy there. It's very short term. It doesn't have a proper global perspective. But the United States really only represents about sort of 20 to 25% of the world economy, and more than 50% of the GDP of the world was represented in the residual countries in the G20. So that was, there's another whole powerhouse out there. It's all the other countries, and they're big. And it's foolish to assume that they are completely powerless and have no agency in the global world today. They definitely do. And they were not swayed by the attempt to kind of push everybody around with this agenda. But I think everybody accepts that the United States, at least from the White House perspective, is not going to pursue the end of fossil fuels as an agenda item. It might become one after the next set of elections in the United States, though.
And Klaas, coming back to you, I mean, ultimately we need to see the handover of the gavel and the presidency to the US. And, you know, when it comes to how this was expected to be done, it was set to take place at the main ceremony on the last day, today, of the G20 Leaders Summit. But we now know that South Africa has since rejected this and instead said it would then do so at the offices of DIRCO in Pretoria. Was this the right approach to have, particularly when there was this diplomatic back and forth the entire year, and even though it was also heightened this week to do this handover at the presidency, or rather at the DIRCO offices in Pretoria?
Look, I think this obviously is an alert to the world leaders or any member of the G20. What we need to do maybe going forward, the world leaders need to come together and establish maybe rules of engagement, establish ways on how things are done. Because as we say now, America decided not to play a role in this one. Now the question is, what are the consequences? Or what precedent are we setting for future? USA is not in good relations with a couple of countries, of course. So what happens in the next G20 when a couple of countries decide that we are not going to go to this G20, or South Africa decide that, look, we're going to actually do the same thing they did to us. So obviously, I feel like South Africa was diplomatic in what they did, but we can't leave it there because it needs to be stopped. We need to find ways, we need to find solutions for future on how they're going to sort of deal with such an issue going forward. Because now it's a startup, like, okay, the handover, we wouldn't just want to give it to a low official. We obviously have to give it to at least an ambassador, or we need to give it to someone from the presidency, because the gates were open. The invitation came, but America decided to sort of not accept it or not follow through. Protocols must be followed always. Protocols are there for a reason. And if USA decides to actually take their own path and decide not to follow the protocols, there's another thing that is opening up for debate or opening up for discussion. And world leaders of the G20 need to come and establish so that they can find ways to curb this and prevent it from happening in future.
And Professor, let's wrap up with you. I mean, now that we know that the G20 is expected to be held next year in the US, and with this friction taking place between the two nations, being South Africa and the US, what is the likelihood of South Africa not being invited to the G20 next year? I mean, the president of South Africa went out of his way to even emphasize that we'll see you there at the G20 at the G20 summit next year.
Well, I think you never quite know how the White House is going to react. They've cancelled visas for many senior South African diplomats. We might actually see them doing that again. It's quite possible that South Africa could be indirectly excluded from the G20 next year. But if that happens, it sets a pretty bad precedent. And I don't think it will go down well globally. On the other hand, South Africa does need to be very careful to make sure that it is continuing to keep the door open to constructive relationships with the United States, because it's a really important country. I think we have a bad administration, and that administration has a bad view of Africa, and it has a bad view of South Africa, a completely crazy view. And I think that that's probably not going to change. But I think that what one wants to do is, despite that, to work very hard to make sure that one doesn't escalate and encourage a degree of petulance against South Africa that will be very unfortunate, more unfortunate for us than for them. But I don't think that we should be conceding to this kind of conduct. I think that we should be assertive, diplomatic, and try and make sure that we keep the bridge built to the United States. There are many administrations to come in the United States and in South Africa, and this is not what will determine our future relationship with the United States. We have to take a long view.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for your views. That's Professor Alex van den Heever from the Wits School of Governance, as well as International Relations Analyst Klaas Mokgomole there, reflecting on the G20 summit that took place this weekend.